just another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time.
All right. We're back. Welcome back to the Baltimore Bureau Podcast Show, everybody.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
I had to do that in honor of Easy Jackson. Always had a song in his heart for whatever we say at the beginning.
It's true.
Hey, Easy.
Hey, Easy, we miss you. In Easy's absence, we will try to keep the energy high. We'll try to keep our commitment to y'all. It's been a pretty crazy past couple weeks. How was your Thanksgiving, Khalilah?
Well, I didn't have Thanksgiving. I shared a day of gratitude with my family in honor of the way that the indigenous people of this land welcome immigrants to our open borders.
Yeah, 100%.
And then had their land stripped from them. Ooh, sorry about that, guys. I have a new phone, and I don't really know how it works because I was Team Galaxy and now I'm Team iPhone.
Oh,
I digress.
A big change.
Anyway, so we actually explicitly talked about just the nature of this holiday that's celebrated. But it was good to be with family, and we had brunch, so that was awesome. And the week before that, I went to see Harry Potter and the Cursed Child on Broadway.
Oh, yeah. That's amazing.
And then Fantastic Beasts 2 days later. So it was...
I also saw Fantastic Beasts on Thanksgiving.
Yeah. The Wizarding World is in my heart.
Mm-hmm. I thought I would hate it, but I really liked it.
Cool.
Worth remembering this lovely holiday of, as you are lifting up, of genocide against indigenous peoples of this land, that the Keystone Pipeline did leak on Thanksgiving. And just worth remembering the, thousands of people who were beaten in the streets and thrown off of their land and refused access to their, sacred drinking water because they said that this would happen. Mm-hmm. There you go. It did. Happy Thanksgiving, dear United States.
And we're going to talk a little bit later in the show about the continued advocacy to prevent pipelines being built here in Maryland and continuation of that pipeline. So, if that isn't enough, then I don't know what will be. But crazy.
Yeah, crazy happening all over every department of this city, many in the federal government as well. And our first story today from Taya Graham and Stephen Janis shows, what the implications of some of those federal decisions can be on a city like this one, like Baltimore. This one is about police reform and the ability of the federal government to exercise oversight over local police departments.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Let's take a look.
On Jeff Sessions' exit from the Department of Justice, he left a last-minute memorandum limiting federal investigations. How will it affect police departments like Baltimore, who are seeking reform and are under consent decree? Sessions made the last-second move to dial back federal police oversight just before Trump asked for and received his resignation. The order would limit the ability of the department's Office of Civil Rights to investigate police departments and enter into consent decrees. Baltimore City entered its own consent decree with the Department of Justice shortly after the DOJ found that the Baltimore City Police Department engaged in unconstitutional and racist tactics.
The police department made roughly 44% of its stops in two small, predominantly African-American districts that contain only 11% of the city's population.
But Sessions' last-minute move raises a question. How will it affect cities like Baltimore, already under the scrutiny of the DOJ? The city's top lawyer, Andre Davis, said he was not concerned.
If that's what it took to get him out of the Justice Department, that's fine. It's not going to affect Baltimore City. It may well affect some cities down the line.
An opinion shared by Maryland ACLU lawyer David Rocha.
The order is a travesty and a repulsive piece of ideological decision-making utterly at odds with the rule of law. That being said, it's not going to have any effect on the consent decree here in Baltimore because that consent decree is already in place and can't be changed at the whim of political ideologues.
But Rocha said the decision could have far-reaching implications for cities like Baltimore with troubled police departments and little recourse.
It's hard to overstate how ridiculous and wrong and unconscionable this document coming from the chief law enforcement official of the entire country is. It is nothing more than a complete abdication of the federal role in ensuring adherence to federal law.
And that it also violated the law enacted during the term of former President Bill Clinton, which authorized the DOJ to investigate unconstitutional policing. Since then, the department has entered over 20 consent decrees. Morgan State University professor Natasha Pratt-Harris says they are a useful tool.
I argue, just based upon their data, they have led to some improvements because they mandate improved community police relations, mandate more accountability, and a structure in place where you have the feds engaging in what's happening in cities to make certain that the agencies are doing their due diligence to protect the people and to not violate their constitutional rights.
In part because a local government bereft of civilian control of police needs outside oversight.
We have hundreds of cities across the country where there are violations often. They don't necessarily have consent decrees. So it's not like this thing manages or maneuvers how we operate as a society. It's something that's put in place to offer a layer of protection.
Former Maryland State Senator Clarence Mitchell IV, the architect of the city's own civilian oversight board, says the DOJ plays a vital role.
We have to understand that this president and his attorney general, they're antithetical to any type of police accountability or anything else. They believe law enforcement first, that type of philosophy. And people knew that when they were voting for him.
But without a strong mechanism for civilian oversight, even the most tenacious reform efforts may fall short.
I mean, I think anything that involves a combination of different eyes, where it's not all centralized in the mayor, is good. But would people vote for it?
This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland.
All right. So, when Jeff Sessions left the DOJ, he tried to pull a quick one.
Yeah, it's his final hurrah, it seems like.
Yeah. Coming down to a local level, there really is an issue between the city solicitor's office and the civilian review board. Yep. Right. The law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights is also a challenge for advocates and community in terms of having accountability. To the extent that, the police are investigating themselves and having the Department of Justice not being supportive of people's civil rights, frankly, is really a tough place to be, because we are trying to build momentum, I think, in terms of proper oversight. We've had so many things like the Gun Trace Task Force and other issues of police corruption that are so flagrant, even down to this spring, obviously this summer, this fall, learning more and more about abuse of overtime. If we have no structure where voters and constituents can hold their police force accountable, then we kind of live in the Wild Wild West.
And even now, when it seems during the hearing that's discussed in this story, when there was so much of an opportunity to discuss that lack of oversight and the methods we could have in a city like this for accountability, there was very little discussion of it. So, I think while obviously the Department of Justice is a deeply flawed and increasingly flawed department, that kind of federal check and balance is very important, and we will,
it's great that it didn't impact our own consent decree. Yeah, truly. We'll see what happens going forward.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not just Baltimore, so we'll see how this affects other cities around the country. Coming back to here,
with national implications.
I think my transitions are off today. But our next piece is one that you did.
Yep. So I spoke with Dr. Lester Spence out of Hopkins. He's a political commentator and professor of political science and Africana studies at Hopkins. And we talked about this $1.8 billion gift from Michael Bloomberg to Hopkins and what that could mean for providing access for students who are either from families with low income or middle-class families. Middle-class families oftentimes get squeezed because they aren't poor enough to qualify for grant money.
So they end up spending all of their savings.
Yeah. Yep.
in deep debt.
Yes, being saddled with debt. Yeah. So let's take a look at what Lester had to say, some awesome comments, and we'll come back. Former New York City mayor and possible 2020 presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg has donated $1.8 billion to his alma mater, Johns Hopkins University. But is that the best way to address educational equity? Bloomberg announced the donation through an editorial in the New York Times. In it, he argued that the gift would allow students to attend the elite university who otherwise would not be able to afford it. He noted that the country's most selective colleges are dominated by students from the top 1%, an imbalance he hoped his gift would help to address, while acknowledging private philanthropy cannot alone stem the tide of the lack of affordability for college. But is donating money to an elite institution really the best way to address educational inequity? And is there a better way to use the money to give students from families with low incomes access to advanced education? We spoke to Hopkins professor of political science, Lester Spence, to explore this question and more. So when you heard about the donation from Bloomberg, what were your initial reactions?
I had a few different reactions. I thought that Hopkins, unlike many of its peers, hasn't really been need blind in admissions. That is, I think that they've been looking at if an applicant that's going to require some type of financial aid, if they apply to the university, they're going to take that application and they're going to give that application, they're not going to treat that application the same as if somebody applied that didn't have need. So a number of universities higher up the ladder have moved to need blind admissions, and Hopkins just hadn't been able to do it. So I thought that it was wonderful that Bloomberg gave the money and explicitly wanted that money used towards making Hopkins more open to lower income students. There are a number of people who've been fighting that struggle within Hopkins for years.
And what do you say to the people who would offer that even with need blind admissions, the lack of equity in the K-12 space in terms of access to the type of preparation that would get you into a Hopkins in some ways makes that kind of donation and a need blind process kind of moot?
I'd agree. I'd push back just a little bit, right? In that we want a dynamic. Okay, so the world we want is a world in which every kid, no matter where they go to school, no matter what neighborhood they grow up in, no matter who their parents are, they have the capacity to live full, rich lives. We want, along those lines, we want college to the ability to attend a college like Hopkins not to be structured by how much loot your family has, what type of high school you go to, what type of zip code you go to. We want that. And then we want some other things too. If that's let's say that's not our Z point. Let's say that's our M point. We're at A. How do we get to M? Right? So one way we get to M is by taking something like this and saying, wow, that's okay, but, right? Like what type of money is being put, like in Baltimore, what type of money is being put in your regular high school versus something like a City, Poly, or Western, or in the Detroit case, what's in your regular high school versus a Cass, King, or a Renaissance, or in your St. Louis case, a Gateway or a Metro, et cetera. Then the question is like, okay, we're all about putting more resources in K through 12 through foundations. That's not really a foundation's job. That's a government's job, right? How do we do that? And in that instance, if you read the Bloomberg's own statement about it, he says clearly, this is a job government should do. So we take advantage of that rhetoric to say, well, listen, he's saying it. We can find other instances of wealthy folks saying it, and then combine that with movement that's been going on. There have been people organizing for decades to make public college tuition free. I can point to Adolph Reed and the work of the Labor Party in the mid 90s, who've been arguing that, and this is way before the second Iraq War, where they priced it out. I think maybe it cost $30 billion or something like that to make public college free. Right, so we take an instance like this and we acknowledge it's deeply imperfect, we acknowledge it's flawed, but it gets us closer to that end moment.
How do you respond to people who say that this type of gift from Bloomberg is short-sighted and should be spread across institutions that are actually serving those kids who come from K-12 environments that weren't as rich and robust, but those institutions decided to take them anyway and have expertise in moving them across the line to graduation?
That's a version of the we need our own billionaire, right? And that critique, while I understand it, the danger of that critique is that what it's basically saying is that it's kind of a racial equity critique, where it takes the structure of capitalism for granted and then just says, well, what we need is a more equitable distribution of that capital, as opposed to saying, you know, this structure is problematic. You know what I mean? So there are people on Twitter who argued, for example, like Bloomberg was a New York mayor. Why doesn't he give that money to CUNY, right? And there was a time when CUNY was producing dope scholars and was free, right? Then there are brothers and sisters who are like, wow, I mean, Howard could use that money. Morgan State could use that money, right? And that's absolutely right. But at the same time, the danger with that is like, okay, what we want to do is get to a point where we're saying that this isn't the model we should be using in general, right? This model is deeply, deeply flawed. It just reproduces the gap between the haves and have-nots, right? Like maybe in this case, it brings Hopkins closer to people it believes to be its peers, but it further separates Hopkins and its peers from public colleges and then private colleges with little to no resources.
So what steps would you encourage governments to take to make the situation more equitable, right? As opposed to adopting the same capitalistic structure?
So we have to segue at the local, state, and federal level towards a dynamic where schools like Hopkins are actually paying taxes instead of providing services in kind, right? So like Hopkins, and most schools like it have kind of an arrangement with the city where instead of giving taxes, they provide expertise or a range of other services. I think that we should be paying taxes. That's the first thing, because there's a lot of tax revenue that's just going by the wayside. And we already know in a city like Baltimore is resource poor, in part for a number of reasons. But when you've got them on the one hand giving $600 million basically to Under Armour and then not taking in taxes from an entity like Hopkins, that just makes them further unable to provide services that Baltimore citizens need, public services that Baltimore citizens need. Secondarily, we need to be moving more towards a dynamic where people shouldn't be paying for college. And we start out with schools like the University of Michigan, go blue, the University of Maryland, and then we move out to include private colleges.
What would you say to someone saying, you know, well, even if college were free, there are colleges not serving anyone, and should they be getting funded to not provide quality education?
I think what's missing there is kind of an understanding about how funding works, how public funding works, right? So if it's publicly funded, there's a mechanism of accountability. Now that mechanism of accountability is imperfect, but we're not just talking about giving loot to somebody and then sending them on their merry way. We're talking about public funding, where actually citizens have the capacity, a far more capacity they do in private institutions, to say, like, listen, this is what we expect, given that this is our institution, right? Because the thing is, it's about giving resources, yes, but it's also about further cementing the idea that that schools like Michigan, which really are public schools, but actually in part because of state clawbacks, they really act more like private schools than public schools. But these public schools actually belong to citizens, right? And even private schools like Hopkins has a public mission. So it's about the funding, yes, but it's about restoring a relationship between citizens and the institutions that are supposed to be ours.
Do you have any questions or concerns about implementation?
So you could just do the math and just do that. You could say, wow, about 900 kids or something like that end up can get into school without having to worry about loot where before they would, right? But then the question is, if we're talking about low-income students, and a number of those are going to be first-generation students, what type of infrastructure is going to be created to build Hopkins out where they can actually give that population, that growing population, the skills they need to actually thrive and transform the school, right? So we can imagine a dynamic, and what they want is, and this is something I will want as well, they want Hopkins to get to the point that at least 20% of their kids are kids coming from lower income backgrounds. And for me, that's a floor, but not a ceiling, but that's a floor we should fight for, right? But I can imagine a dynamic. I'm not going to mention any names, but I remember when I was a kid at Michigan, and there was a kid younger than me who grew up in, not in Detroit, I have to say that, not in Detroit, but he grew up in another hard-hit neighborhood, and he became a peer advisor. And when he was a peer advisor, another working class kid got into some trouble, and he had to come before the peer advisor, right, including him. And that peer advisor told that kid, you need to leave the ghetto at home, right? And he thought he was doing, I shouldn't even say the gender, but he thought he was doing the right thing. But I remember thinking as a kid, right? Like, no, you don't tell somebody that. What we want is we want schools like Hopkins to change to reflect us. We don't want to come into a school, like as a professor, I don't come into Hopkins and change myself for Hopkins. Like, I'm supposed to be here.
Any other final thoughts you'd want to share?
I think it's really, really important that we embed our critiques of capital and capitalism, and it's possible to have a trenchant critique of capitalism while still believing somebody's motives when they say, for example, I really want to help lower income students, right? Because if we're not able to do that, if we're not able to do that both and move, to say, okay, I believe Bloomberg when he says he wants to help kids, and say this is a really, really bad model, then that basically builds into our critique this idea that in order to really contest capitalism, we need capitalists to be evil and duplicitous, right? And that's actually not the case. I mean, in a lot of cases they are, but there are capitalists that we really strongly disagree with, and we want another world that actually that will simultaneously say that we want police to stop and frisk on one hand, and we want to create more opportunities for lower income kids on the other, and hold both those ideas at the same time and believe in them strongly, right? That's what we're fighting. And we have to be able to articulate it clearly, because I don't believe, in this case, Bloomberg's been giving money to Hopkins for years, and he's been giving, as long as I've been here, most of his funding has been about kind of building Hopkins' capacity to learn and to research, and then providing resources to folks in need.
Some people have said that he's doing this to support how he appears to the public for his potential run for president.
That's probably part of it. But I don't think that's the guiding factor. I don't think that's part of it. And that's empirically testable, right? That is to say that, if it happens and he's running, and every time he's running, he's like here in Baltimore with some kid who went to school through his money, then we'll know. So I want y'all to come back. So hopefully we'll all be around in a few years. Y'all can come back and be like, yo, you was wrong. And I'll be like, yeah, damn, I was wrong on that. I tend to think I can go at somebody pretty hard and still take them at their word. So I think that is part of that, but I don't think it's the big part of it. And and it's also, and again, it's important to note, people at Hopkins have been fighting for this for years. That's actually really important. Some folks who aren't even here anymore, right? Some scholars who, I can think of one scholar in particular, he's at Brown now. People have been fighting in Hopkins for this for years. So the other thing is that we're not necessarily, by solely thinking about this as something that he did for his own purposes, we're not actually taking into account the politics that that happened within Hopkins, right? That actually led to, because what probably happened is President Daniels has been probably urging him for years to do this. It's probably been a dialogue, and that dialogue doesn't come without people at Hopkins, students, faculty, staff, administrators fighting for that. So that's the other thing to actually keep in mind.
I was happy to hear you ask him about the critiques of this deal, specifically like the critique that maybe Hopkins is not the institution that should be getting that $1.8 billion. Mm-hmm. And I thought that his response to that, basically saying that, that critique just assumes that we need our own billionaire, I think is really interesting. And I do appreciate his comments that say that, it's good that this is specifically being allocated for need-based scholarships rather than need-blind. Mm-hmm. But I wonder, like, if this $1.8 billion, while it's great that more students are going to be accepted into Hopkins, does that further, ingrain the dependence on billionaires for education?
So Lester spoke to that, as did Michael Bloomberg. In his own statement, Michael Bloomberg said, this is not the way to make college affordable.
Yeah, and his opinion piece in the Times,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. So, Lester said that Hopkins should be paying taxes in Baltimore, mm-hmm. and Harvard should be paying taxes in 100%. Cambridge, and so on and so forth. You have these well-endowed institutions that are supposedly giving benefits to the communities that they exist in, but they don't pay any taxes, even 1%, 2% taxes. So that was critical, but also this idea that some philanthropist is going to come swoop in and save every institution is really nonsensical, but it's also not a system that's sustainable.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it's the one that we have now, but mm-hmm. we'll see, I think.
And furthermore, students who are, we know there is research that says students who really have the aptitude to succeed at institutions like Hopkins aren't applying. Okay. And then you have the case where if your K-12 experience was not as solid as it could be, you still don't have access to Hopkins, regardless of your family's income.
Right.
So there's so many layers, and I think if we can use this gift or folk in the higher ed space can use this gift to advocate for policies that move us closer to free college and eliminating student debt, that would be a huge boon for our economy. We see in Maryland that there's an attempt to make community college free, mm-hmm. but even in that legislation, there's so many gates that it ends up being not free, frankly.
Sure.
And, we can't, either we mean it or we don't, that young people should be able to go to college, get the type of education they need to contribute to society, especially in a fast-moving society that includes a future of work that will eliminate many of the jobs that we have today.
Yeah, many of the jobs that people are being trained for today.
Exactly. So, we'll see what happens, but we're going to continue to follow this case and or this situation and see how it does impact other institutions.
Sure.
Providing students with affordable college.
Yeah, we shall see.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, I think it's amazing that folks who you've spoken to have also pushed to make sure that community college space is, providing the kinds of education that one would hope to get at a private institution as well.
Right.
So I hope that while examining this $1.8 billion gifts, folks can also, choose to keep examining what can be done for institutions that are, frankly, like impacting and serving more people who wouldn't have the opportunity to get into mm-hmm. a Hopkins. So something to keep up with for sure.
Yep. So this next piece is from you. Back to the top of the podcast where we were talking about the pipeline that is now leaking, the Keystone pipeline, and advocacy from folk in Maryland to block the National Park Service from extending the Potomac pipeline here.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's take a look and talk a little bit more about it.
Earlier this month, a federal judge blocked the construction of energy giant TransCanada's Keystone XL pipeline. The 1,200-mile-long pipeline was designed to transport natural gas from Alberta, Canada's tar sands into the U.S. In Maryland, environmental advocates are protesting another TransCanada pipeline that would move gas from Pennsylvania to West Virginia.
No Potomac pipeline! No Potomac pipeline!
Armed with a petition signed by nearly 9,000 people, dozens of environmental advocates rallied at the National Park Service's Chesapeake and Ohio Canal headquarters. They demanded that the NPS deny TransCanada a right-of-way permit and thereby halt the construction of the Eastern Panhandle Expansion Project, also known as the Potomac Pipeline.
Here in Washington County and in Berkeley County, nearly 100,000 residents would have their water impacted and contaminated if a blowout were to occur. Scientists around the world have said we have 12 years to drastically change our ways, and now is not the time to be putting more fossil fuel infrastructure in that'll lock us in for decades of frack gas use. It also harms our neighbors in Pennsylvania and West Virginia.
We also have the very, very real risk of the drilling encountering a void under the Potomac River, which then you would lose millions of gallons of drilling mud into a void that could potentially contaminate the Potomac River for a very long time, and that cannot be mitigated.
The pipeline would be built beneath the C&O Canal, near Maryland's Pennsylvania and West Virginia borders. TransCanada says the pipeline would be safe and environmentally friendly.
HDD is a trenchless method of installing pipelines underneath water bodies, roads, railways, buildings, and other structures. It is an environmentally friendly method used to cross sensitive areas that significantly reduces impact to the land above the drilling site and surrounding communities.
But critics say it's dangerous because it could explode and because despite safeguards, it will inevitably leak methane, which is a leading contributor to climate change. If it leaks, they say it will also affect a major water source.
Yes, the technology might be very safe in certain circumstances, but with man-made issues and decisions and engineering and pushing the limits, there's a number of risks that could be had.
Natural gas is also harmful to people's health. And of course, an explosion, well, that could just outright kill people in the course of the accident.
Under the C&O Canal, the pipeline would go through soluble rock, or karst geology, which the environmentalists say make it more prone to leaks.
You think of it as the Swiss cheese of geology. It allows contaminants both on the ground and in the ground to flow very fast and very quickly.
The Potomac Pipeline would also be the energy source for the controversial Rockwool USA insulation manufacturing plant in Jefferson County, West Virginia, which protesters also say could have devastating health and environmental impact.
Rockwool would be a highly polluting facility that would put formaldehyde, bisphenol, particulate matter, benzene, and all manner of other cancer-causing substances into the air.
We reached out to Rockwool for comment, and they said there's a crucial distinction between emissions from the chimney stacks and the concentrations of those emissions at ground level. While of course related, it is the latter that determines the health and environmental impact in the area, but the former that project opponents focus on. This fight comes just weeks after the re-election of Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, who signed a fracking ban in 2017, but has backed the construction of the Potomac Pipeline, which will ship fracked gas.
Hogan did sign that frack ban, but somehow he's not appropriately opposed to the gas industry like he should be.
The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection have already approved the construction of the Potomac Pipeline, and in West Virginia, construction has already begun. But the protesters say they'll continue to fight.
The FERC has approved it, but the FERC approves all pipelines. The West Virginia DEP has approved most of the pipeline, but not the section that would go, the final section that would go to Rockwool. We will fight this at the DEP and the Public Service Commission to keep the tail end of the pipeline, the final leg of the pipeline, from going through to Rockwool. We will fight till the end.
Here in Maryland, we're going to take our fight to Annapolis and make sure that things like this don't happen.
We reached out to TransCanada for response, but didn't receive it by time of publishing. For The Real News, Dharna Noor in Hagerstown, Maryland.
So again, this pipeline that we will likely see crossing into Maryland is owned by the same company, TransCanada, that's now infamous for their Keystone XL pipeline. And while this is much, much shorter, like, this is 3.5 miles long, the Keystone XL is some 12,000 miles long, I think people have very similar concerns. So I think to watch those connections being built throughout the nation with these kinds of fights has been really inspiring, but also really, really scary, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, and in the story they talk about 100,000 possible families that are impacted, and that may seem small, but the fact that government would allow for a structure to be built that could potentially poison 100,000 families, households.
And their drinking water,
is egregious. And, this again causes us to really consider the tension between capitalism and the idea that, if whatever we can do to make more money, we can take the risk that maybe 100,000 people are drinking poison water.
Sure.
Because that's ultimately what it boils down to, right? Like, we need to have this because we want the oil so we can make the money from it.
Yeah, 100%.
Right?
Although it's always branded like, we want this, we need this fracked oil, or this fracked gas in this case, because we need it for you, because we need to serve you, because this extremely controversial insulation plant will be serving you, because we'll be bringing you more jobs. When
that's the thing that really is used to get people on board. Jobs. You'll get jobs. I know you'll have cancer, but you'll have jobs in the community. Or your kids may have autism, or your kids may have asthma and not make it past their 6th birthday, but there'll be jobs here. But folk don't really put together the fact that as soon as someone says jobs, they mean profit, right? Jobs don't come from people holding hands and singing Kumbaya.
Exactly. What kinds of jobs?
Yeah.
Jobs where you are building your own community and working for yours, or jobs where you are creating a surplus profit, which is then going to be taken by, in this case, our lovely TransCanada. Agreed. I think that's a missing piece of that argument, and just shows, I think, even more the need, more of that need for, better organized labor and better, supported labor in the green spaces and in the sustainable economy.
Absolutely.
I think you've talked about this a lot as well, but unless we get those jobs to a point where they can compete, I think that this rhetoric is still going to have a lot of effect on people.
Right.
So we have a long way to go there.
Yep. And, that is also, as you mentioned, a critical factor that people say, if these jobs that are coming allow me to feed my family, then I'm going to go ahead and support it. And so be it that we may get poison, right? And then it's not as deep. But if we can organize labor around making sure we can see the replacements job to job from into the green and sustainable economy, I think there would be way more support in being proactive about not damaging the environment. So
yeah, certainly. And of course, per always, I feel like a broken record saying this, but per always, this insulation plant would be largely affecting a low-income neighborhood, a neighborhood that's has a lot of working class people in it, a lot of people of color in it, and that's something that we see across the board when it comes to this kind of environmental degradation, and those kinds of climate impacts too on the larger scale are also disproportionately impacting people of color, people who are struggling financially, which is, I think, a good segue into our last story, which comes from the other side of the world, from our reporter Jessel Noor.
So I love this story's I love the way this story connects all young people who are advocating in the struggle to have true unity, to dismantle racism and oppression, and to make sure that people have access to the resources needed to live their best lives, right? Like that people have the ability to access human rights at a base level. And we're seeing socialism prop up not only excuse me, not socialism, fascism cropping up around the globe. Sorry. And it's insidious. It's coming in different forms. Whether the rhetoric is about nationalism or Brexit, I think young people, as per always in justice movements and civil rights advocacy and revolution, the young people are like, no, not having it, and it is wrong, and we need to do something about this. So let's take a look at justice coverage over across the pond.
Amidst Britain's greatest political crisis in generations, thousands have taken to the streets in London, England, to oppose racism, fascism, and the rise of the far right.
We are the younger generation. We should be at the forefront of the fight. We should stand up. This is our future. We should stand up to racism. We should stand up to fascism. Every time they turn up on our street, we block them. We outnumber them.
We're here protesting against racism with the solidarity demonstration taking place. But we're from the Socialist Party, and we say that fight against racism must be linked to fight against austerity, against cuts, and that's why we're chanting here that we want the Tories out. The racist Tories need to go.
For the Tories in the sea! Let in every refugee! For the Tories in the sea!
To show my solidarity towards the oppressed communities, to stand up and show the government and the people in power, and also the people that are now coming out of the woodwork with the far right movement and with their racist narratives and racist rhetoric, to stand up against them and to show, London, the world, that there are people that oppose it.
I'm here today for the simple reason that racism and discrimination is the scourge of our country, and as a member of the Labour Party and as a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, that is very, very important to me, and we need to be out there on the streets and fight racism. We need to organise and build a better society.
We're just here to demonstrate against racism and to show that the football scene isn't dominated by the far right. That's just a small minority. Most of us care about the working class as a whole, regardless of race or creed.
England and Europe and the world is moving more to the right, and I think that people need to stand up and say that this is not a good thing, that we need to respect all people.
The United Kingdom has been gripped with uncertainty surrounding Brexit, next year's scheduled departure from the European Union. Prime Minister Theresa May's future remains uncertain. She sparked calls for a mutiny among her own party after presenting a widely panned Brexit deal that prompted the resignation of two of her cabinet ministers.
It is an absolute disaster. I think that her policies are a disaster. Nobody can tell us exactly what is going to happen. Nobody knows. I don't think they even know. So we should have a new referendum, and there should be a people's vote.
Reports of hate crimes have risen dramatically since Britons voted to leave the European Union in 2016.
Well, where I teach is at sitting at Islington College, so we have a very mixed community there, and of course, particularly the young people there are becoming very aware of all the attacks that are going on, of particularly Islamophobia.
Sadly, there's a group of people here who have a small country mentality and see anyone who's different as a threat. And this has sort of eaten into the Brexit mentality as well. A lot of people see people who are different as something we have to be frightened of, which is complete nonsense.
Reporting for The Real News, I'm Jessel Noor in London, England.
So again, really awesome, really troubling, to see how, pervasive these ideas continue to be.
Certainly.
As if we have not learned lessons from the past and the very recent past, right? We're not talking about the Revolutionary War. We're talking about World War II. We're talking about Jim Crow. We're talking about, Windrush families being told that they're not citizens after they came to support Great Britain from colonized islands and told that they had citizenship, only for now to be told they're not really citizens, Yeah. It's like all connected.
And like with so many things, it's so hard to pinpoint any, one event on, any other sort of single political force. But we have seen in the UK the number of hate crimes go up dramatically. And of course, you can't say, it's not like everybody who's engaging in these sorts of horrific hate crimes are coming out and saying, oh, I'm doing this because fascism is on the rise, or I'm doing this because so many people supported Brexit for racist and nationalistic reasons. But that correlation, I think you don't need to always be able to prove an exact correlation in order to see the general patterns and the general trends. Which is something I think is really interesting in a protest like this, where they're not just protesting, their political leaders, not just protesting their elected officials, but also the culture that's coming up within like their communities, within the movements that they're parts of. So to locate this not only in like the prime minister's office, but also in the way that
day-to-day
individuals,
life.
in day-to-day life and football games or
oh my gosh, football games are sometimes scary places to be.
Truly.
Like throwing bananas at footballers on the field and making 8 noises, like ridiculous. But this is your team, right? Man United, you're for them. I mean, today is the start of the trial for old boy who ran down the counter protesters in Charlottesville, right? So it's so ironic that, again, the way the globe is connected so positively, there are so many insidious ways that we're connected, and we really need to disrupt and reclaim what we believe will allow us to live in a global society.
Definitely.
And survive on this planet, because we also had a report this weekend from the White House about climate change. And
on Black Friday. When nobody is reading the news.
But, climate change bad. Go shop.
Yeah, exactly.
So we can't address those things if we are not paying attention to the things that are really distractions, but also can unravel the social fabric enough to have us focus on things like war. When at a base level we can have as many wars as we want if the planet doesn't exist.
And also, again, like this past weekend, a report came out, again, showing that that the Pentagon is the number one emitter. You can often on Black Friday go out and buy lots of things that are packaged in petroleum products, endlessly packaged and then packaged again, so that you can buy them and then throw them away after, for the packaging, 2 seconds, for the item itself, maybe 2 months. So, all of these... all of these sorts of issues have a lot of impact on the planet. It's been cool to see a number of movements cropping up here, and also seeing the counterparts in London. Jessel's also been reporting on some climate protests over there, some climate movements cropping up over there, some protests to protect people from gun violence over there. This burgeoning anti-violence and anti-racism movement. So.
I mean, on the flip side, it's really good, right? Because to know you're not in it alone, and that there are people around the globe saying, nope, we're not with it either.
Certainly.
So let's get together, and we're going to do our part where we are, do your part where you are, and if we can figure out how to support one another, that's good. Because, of course we want the President of the United States to be able to go abroad and not be heavily protested, but it was a little bit heartening to see the protests for our president when he visited France, and folk were like, Also, when he visited Great Britain before that,
totally.
Like, no, we don't want it.
Yeah, we don't want yours.
Yeah. All right. Well, tomorrow is another critical race in national elections with the Mississippi runoff. I'm going to do a story about that. But so much more to do.
So much more to do. We're going to be, a number of us here at The Real News are going to be headed off to the Sanders Institute gathering in Burlington, Vermont, to sort of examine what a unified left would look like for, for the whole globe. There's going to be people there from the UK, from the Labour Party. There's going to be people there from Greece. A number of folks from Puerto Rico are coming to discuss the effects of austerity.
Nice.
So we'll come back with some info for you.
All right.
But we can end with a little bit of joy, I guess, after all of this. We need some joy right now.
Joy.
One, I think, one beautiful moment of light this past weekend was that Joy Postel released a new album. Shout out to Joy Postel for bringing joy to all of us across the city.
Yeah.
Also, former Real Newser Sharena Ashanti actually did the choreography for her. So shout out to her too.
Dope Rainfall Dance.
Yeah.
And shout outs to Dwayne Gladden, Stephen Frank, and David Hebden for all they do behind the scenes to bring you this podcast.
Yeah.
Let's check out this moment of joy.
We love you, Bonnie.
North Star, please lead us on the other side, back to where we belong. On the other side, North Star, please lead us on the other side, back to where we belong. On the other side, North Star, please lead us on the other side, back to where we belong. On the other side, North Star, please lead us on the other side, back to where we belong. On the other side, I just wanna be free. I just wanna be free. On the other side, I just wanna be free. Said I just wanna be free. I just wanna